The sickening crack of her forehead hitting the metal table silenced the entire emergency room. Dr. Julian Thorne, the hospital's arrogant golden boy, didn't just stop the quiet nurse from saving a dying homeless man. He grabbed her hair and slammed her face into the steel tray, screaming at her to know her place. The staff froze, expecting the timid, invisible nurse to beg for mercy while the blood ran down her face. But they didn't know that the woman trembling on the floor wasn't just a nurse. She was Major Elara Vance, a Tier 1 combat medic known as the Ghost, who had stared down death in the deserts of Syria. And Dr. Thorne? He hadn't just assaulted a subordinate. He had just woken up a sleeping predator. The wind howling off the Charles River didn't just blow, it bit. It was a typical February night in Boston, the kind of cold that seeped through heavy wool coats and settled deep into the bones. Snow had been falling sideways since noon, turning the city streets into a slushy gray maze of gridlocked traffic and miserable pedestrians. Inside St. Jude Hospital, however, the temperature was a constant, sterile 68 degrees, though the atmosphere felt significantly colder. The fluorescent lights hummed with a headache-inducing frequency, casting long, pale shadows across the linoleum floors of the emergency room. Elara Vance moved through those shadows like she was part of them. She was a woman of indeterminate age, perhaps 30, perhaps older, with features that might have been striking if she ever allowed any expression to inhabit them. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, practical bun beneath a blue scrub cap. Her eyes were the color of wet slate, unreadable and terrifyingly calm. While other nurses wore short sleeves to combat the stifling heat of the trauma bays, Elara always wore a tight, long-sleeved thermal shirt under her scrubs. It covered her from wrist to neck, a second skin she never removed. "Bed 4 needs a turnover," the charge nurse barked from behind the central station. Elara didn't verbally acknowledge the order. She simply adjusted her gloves and moved. Her movements were economic, precise. There was no wasted energy in the way she stripped the bloody sheets, sanitized the rails, and restocked the IV kits. She worked with the rhythm of a machine. To her colleagues, she was a ghost. She didn't participate in the break room gossip about who was sleeping with whom. She didn't laugh at the dark humor the doctors used to cope with death. She just worked. "Hey, Vance," a passing orderly sneered, bumping her shoulder as he walked by with a tray of food. "You forget how to speak again?" Elara didn't flinch. She didn't even look up. She finished aligning the pillows, the corners perfectly sharp, and moved to the next task. To them, her silence was arrogance or stupidity. They didn't know that silence was a survival mechanism. In the noise of her past, silence was the only thing that kept you alive. Across the room, near the pediatric bay, the sharp, jagged cry of a child cut through the ambient noise of beeping monitors and rolling gurneys. Dr. Toby Miller was sweating. He was a first-year intern, a young man with messy brown hair and glasses that kept sliding down, a nose slick with perspiration. He looked less like a doctor and more like a college student who had walked into the wrong classroom. He was hovering over a 6-year-old boy named Leo, who was screaming at the top of his lungs. Leo's mother stood by the bedside, her face twisted with anxiety and rising anger. I can't find it," Toby muttered, his hands shaking slightly as he palpated the boy's small, chubby arm for a vein. "He's dehydrated. The veins have collapsed." "You've poked him 3 times," the mother snapped, stepping closer. "Get someone who knows what they're doing." "I'm trying, ma'am. Please, just give me a second," Toby pleaded, his voice cracking. He was drowning. The pressure was mounting, and the boy's thrashing was making the procedure impossible. Toby held the needle, but he was frozen, terrified of hurting the child again. Elara was there before anyone noticed she had crossed the room. She didn't announce her presence. She simply glided into the space between the intern and the equipment cart. The air seemed to settle around her. She looked at the screaming boy, not with pity, but with an intense, focused assessment. She reached out, her hand, gloved and steady as a rock, bypassed the needle and landed gently on the boy's shoulder, near the base of his neck. It wasn't a hug. It was a calculated pressure point. She pressed her thumb firmly but gently into the muscle. Almost instantly, Leo's breathing hitched. The screaming dialed down to a whimper, his eyes widening as he looked up at the woman in the blue mask. It was a trick she had learned from a local healer in a village halfway across the world, a way to disrupt the panic response in the nervous system. Toby looked up at her, his eyes wide with relief and confusion. "Nurse Vance? I can't get the line." Elara didn't look at Toby. Her eyes were locked on the boy's arm. She didn't take the needle from the doctor. That would undermine him. Instead, she moved her other hand to the boy's forearm. She didn't slap the vein to make it rise. She simply ran 2 fingers down the inside of the elbow, stopping at a spot that looked completely flat to the naked eye. She held her finger there, marking the spot, and gave Toby a single, sharp nod. "Trust the anatomy, not your eyes," the nod seemed to say. Toby swallowed hard. He trusted her. He guided the needle to exactly where her finger pointed. A flash of red appeared in the chamber. A perfect stick. "I'm in," Toby breathed out, taping the line down quickly. "Oh, thank God." The mother let out a long sigh, her shoulders dropping. "Thank you," she said, looking at Toby. "Thank you, doctor." Toby wiped his forehead with his sleeve, a nervous smile appearing. "Actually, it was—" He turned to credit Elara, but she was already gone. She was back at the supply cart, counting saline bags, as if the moment of connection had never happened. The peace of the ER, however, was fragile. At 2 a.m., the double doors swung open, not for a patient, but for the king of the department. Dr. Julian Thorne strode into the room. He was a man who looked like he had been genetically engineered for a medical drama billboard. Tall, with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a jawline that could cut glass, he wore custom-tailored navy scrubs that cost more than Elara's monthly rent. He was the chief of thoracic surgery, a legacy doctor whose father's name was on the hospital wing. He moved with an air of aggressive entitlement, the kind that assumed the air parted for him out of respect, not fear. The atmosphere in the ER shifted instantly. Nurses straightened their posture. Interns looked down at their clipboards. Thorne was brilliant, undeniably, but he was a tyrant who ruled through humiliation. Who was in charge of the post-op notes for the thoracotomy in Bay 2? Thorne's voice boomed, cutting through the hum of the room. It was a smooth baritone, rich and dangerous. Silence. Thorne walked to the central station, picking up a metal clipboard. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on David, the charge nurse. "David, why is this file incomplete?" David stammered. "Dr. Thorne, I believe you performed the surgery, sir. The notes need your signature before we can process the discharge." Thorne's face darkened. He knew he had forgotten to sign it. He had been in a rush to make a dinner reservation. But Julian Thorne did not make mistakes, and if he did, they were certainly not his fault. "So you're telling me," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly low volume, walking around the desk, "that my staff is so incompetent that they cannot remind me of administrative trivia? You let a patient sit there for 3 hours because you were too scared to page me?" He needed a target, someone to vent the frustration of a bad date and a long night upon. His eyes swept the room and landed on the figure in the corner, the quiet one, the one who never fought back. "Vance!" Thorne barked. Elara paused mid-step. She turned slowly. She was holding a tray of sterilized instruments. "Get over here," Thorne commanded. Elara walked over, her gait steady. She stopped 3 feet from him, her hands clasped in front of her, the tray held securely. "Did you prep Bay 2 for the next patient?" Thorne asked. "Yes, doctor," Elara said. Her voice was low, raspy, as if she didn't use it enough. "Then why?" Thorne sneered, holding up the clipboard. "Is this file still sitting here? Why didn't you bring it to my office for a signature? Is it because you're lazy, Vance? Or are you just stupid?" It was a nonsensical accusation. It wasn't a nurse's job to chase surgeons for signatures on surgical notes. It was entirely Thorne's responsibility. Everyone in the room knew it. Toby, watching from the corner, felt sick. He wanted to say something, but he looked at Thorne's furious face and looked away. Cowardice was contagious in St. Jude. Elara looked at Thorne. She analyzed him in a split second. Dilated pupils, stress or stimulants, elevated respiratory rate. He was looking for a fight to assert dominance. Engaging him verbally would only escalate the situation. "My apologies, doctor," Elara said flatly. "I was attending to a patient." "Apologies don't fix incompetence," Thorne roared. The violence was sudden. Thorne didn't hit her with his hand. He took the heavy metal clipboard, loaded with thick files, and flung it. It wasn't a toss. It was a throw. The sharp metal edge of the clipboard spun through the air and struck Elara hard on the shoulder, just below the collarbone. The sound of metal hitting bone, a dull thud, echoed in the silent ER. The files exploded outward, papers fluttering to the floor like dead leaves. Gasps rippled through the room. A young nurse covered her mouth. Toby took a half step forward, then froze. It must have hurt. It had to hurt. But Elara didn't cry out. She didn't grab her shoulder. She didn't cower. She didn't even blink. The clipboard clattered to the floor. Thorne stood there, chest heaving, waiting for the reaction. He wanted the tears. He wanted the fear. That was the fuel that powered his ego. But Elara just stood there. She looked at the papers scattered at her feet. Then, slowly, gracefully, she bent down. She gathered the papers into a neat pile. She picked up the clipboard. She straightened the edges. She stood up and held the clipboard out to him. "You drop this, doctor," she said. Her voice was devoid of sarcasm. It was devoid of anger. It was simply empty. But her eyes, those slate-gray eyes, bored into him. They weren't the eyes of a subordinate. They were the eyes of a predator looking at a very small, very noisy animal, deciding it wasn't worth the calories to kill. Thorne snatched the clipboard back, his face flushing red. He had tried to break her, and instead, he felt like he was the one who had cracked. Her lack of reaction was an insult greater than any scream. "Get out of my face!" Thorne hissed, turning his back on her. "And if I see you slacking off again, you're fired. I don't care how short-staffed we are." Elara didn't respond. She simply turned and walked back to the shadows of the supply closet. As she stepped into the darkness of the small room, only then did she reach up with her right hand and touch her left shoulder. She felt the bruise forming under the fabric. She took a deep breath. In for 4 seconds, hold for 4, out for 4. Pain was information. That was all. And compared to the things she had survived in the sandbox, Julian Thorne was nothing more than a child throwing a toy. But as she looked down at her hands, she noticed a slight tremor in her fingers. She clenched her fist, forcing the shaking to stop. The storm outside was getting worse, and Elara had a feeling the night was far from over. The storm outside had mutated. What had started as a typical New England snowfall had curdled into a whiteout beast. A nor'easter burying Boston under 2 feet of heavy, wet concrete. The wind howled against the reinforced glass of the ambulance bay doors, a constant mournful shriek that vibrated through the walls of St. Jude Hospital. Inside, the uneasy quiet of the early shift had shattered. At 3:14 a.m., the red phone at the Central Nursing Station, a dedicated line for mass casualty events, began to ring. It was a shrill, mechanical trill that made every stomach in the room drop. David, the charge nurse, snatched it up. His face, usually flushed with the stress of the job, drained of color within seconds. He slammed the receiver down and stood on his chair, his voice cracking over the din. "Code triage, listen up. We have a massive pileup on the Tobin Bridge. A jackknife tanker truck took out 4 sedans and a transport bus. Visibility is 0. We have 15 incoming, 5 critical. ETA is 5 minutes. Clear the hallways. I want trauma bays 1 through 4 prepped and open now." The ER exploded into controlled chaos. Nurses sprinted for supply carts. Residents grabbed ultrasound machines. The lazy hum of the night shift vanished, replaced by the frantic energy of preparation. But for Elara Vance, the chaos was different. It was acoustic. It started with the sirens. First one, then a chorus of them, wailing in dissonance as they approached from the highway. Then came the radio chatter, a static-filled stream of panic screaming about multiple amputations and fire on the deck. But then came the sound that tore through her defenses. Above the sirens, a low, rhythmic thumping vibrated in her chest. Thwup, thwup, thwup. It was the unmistakable beat of a medevac helicopter rotor, cutting through the storm, struggling to land on the roof pad. Elara froze. She was standing in the middle of Trauma Bay 2, holding a bag of saline. Her hands, usually surgical in their steadiness, locked up. The fluorescent lights of the hospital seemed to strobe, syncing perfectly with the beat of the rotor blades. Thwup, Thwop, thwop. The white walls of the ER dissolved. Suddenly, she wasn't in Boston. She wasn't cold. She was sweltering, the air tasting of copper and dry, choking dust. The white floor became yellow sand. The howling wind wasn't a blizzard. It was a sandstorm in the Kandahar province. Elara, pressure, keep pressure on it. The voice wasn't David's. It was young, terrified. It was Jamie, her little brother. She looked down. In the memory, her hands weren't holding a saline bag. They were pressed deep into the cavity of a chest that was far too small, trying to stem a tide of red that wouldn't stop. The Black Hawk helicopter was hovering above them, kicking up a blinding cloud of grit, its rotors screaming the same song as the one above the hospital roof. I can't feel my legs, Elle," Jamie whispered, his eyes wide, reflecting the burning wreckage of their convoy. "Don't leave me." "I'm here, Jamie. I've got you," Elara whispered back, but in the ER, her voice was barely a breath. The saline bag slipped from her fingers. It hit the floor with a wet slap, bursting open. The sound snapped a nearby nurse's attention toward her. "Vance, you okay? We need that bay ready." Elara blinked. The sand vanished. The cold returned. But the noise in her head, the screaming rotors, Jamie's last gasping breath, was deafening. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was drowning in the noise. "Supplies," Elara muttered, her voice thick. "I need more saline." She turned and walked, not ran, toward the supply closet. She kept her pace even, forcing her legs to move one in front of the other, hiding the tremor that was starting to seize her entire body. As soon as the heavy door of the supply closet clicked shut, plunging her into semi-darkness, Elara collapsed. She slid down the metal shelving unit until she hit the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She pressed the heels of her palms into her eyes, trying to push the image of Jamie's lifeless face back into the vault where she kept her ghosts. 30 seconds. You have 30 seconds. She began the ritual. It was the only thing that worked. Inhale, 2, 3, 4. She visualized a box. She put the sand in the box. Hold, 2, 3, 4. She put the blood in the box. She put Jamie's voice in the box. Exhale, 2, 3, 4. She imagined locking the box and sinking it into the deepest part of the ocean. Hold, 2, 3, 4. The trembling in her hands slowed. The room stopped spinning. The noise of the helicopter above faded from a roar to a dull hum. Elara opened her eyes. The steel returned to her gaze, harder and colder than before. She stood up, smoothed her scrubs, grabbed a fresh bag of saline, and opened the door. She stepped back into the fray just as the double doors of the ambulance bay burst open. A gust of freezing wind and snowflakes swirled into the heated room, followed by a team of paramedics pushing a gurney with frantic urgency. Leading the charge was Gino, a veteran paramedic with a barrel chest and a beard caked in ice. He looked exhausted, his high-visibility jacket smeared with grease and blood. "Trauma 1, Gino bellowed, his voice hoarse. "Male, John Doe, approx age 60, found unresponsive under the bridge overpass. He wasn't in the crash. He got hit by a diversion vehicle that skidded onto the sidewalk. Blunt force trauma to the chest. BP is 60/40. He's crashing." They shoved the gurney into the bay. Elara was there instantly, cutting through the crowd of confused residents. The patient was a mess. He was buried under layers of filthy, mismatched coats that smelled of stale urine, wet wool, and cheap whiskey. His beard was a tangled thicket of gray and white, matted with mud. His face was weather-beaten, the skin like leather that had been left out in the sun too long. "He smells like a distillery," a young resident wrinkled his nose, stepping back. "He's bleeding internally," Elara snapped, ignoring the smell. She grabbed a pair of trauma shears and began cutting through the thick, sodden layers of his clothing. "Get a line in. Type and cross for 4 units. O negative, now." Her authority cut through the resident's hesitation. He scrambled to obey. As Elara peeled back the final layer of a tattered flannel shirt, she saw the damage. The man's chest was a ruin. The entire right side of his ribcage was caved in. The skin bruised a violent purple and black. When he took a shallow, rattling breath, a section of his chest wall moved inward while the rest expanded. flail chest. "We need to intubate," Elara announced, looking at the monitor. His oxygen saturation was plummeting. "Page Thorne, we need a chest tube immediately." "I'm here." The voice was smooth, annoyed, and utterly devoid of urgency. Dr. Julian Thorne stepped into the trauma bay. He was holding a cup of coffee, looking immaculate despite the chaos around him. He didn't step closer to the bed. He stayed in the doorway, observing the scene with a look of distaste. Thorne looked at the monitor. Then he looked at the patient. He took in the filth, the smell, the matted beard, and the lack of any identifying information. "Status?" Thorne asked, taking a sip of his coffee. "Flail chest on the right side, likely hemopneumothorax," Elara reported, her hands moving quickly to stabilize the man's neck. "BP is bottoming out. He needs a tube and immediate surgery to stabilize the rib cage." Thorne walked forward, his expensive loafers clicking on the floor. He leaned over, not to examine the patient's injuries, but to sniff the air. He recoiled slightly. "Ethanol," Thorne stated, as if diagnosing a rare disease. "He's drunk. Probably stumbled into the road." "He was hit by a car, doctor," Gino the paramedic argued, wiping melting snow from his forehead. "He's dying." Thorne checked his watch. "I have Councilman Sterling's daughter arriving by chopper in 4 minutes. She was in the lead car of the pileup. Possible spinal injury. I need this trauma bay clear, and I need the OR prepped for her." Elara stopped moving. She looked up at Thorne. "This man will not survive a transfer. He has minutes, not hours." Thorne looked at Elara with a sneer that didn't quite reach his eyes. "This is triage, Vance. Basic medical math. We have limited resources. We have a young, healthy woman with a bright future coming in, and we have—" He gestured vaguely at the unconscious, broken man on the table. "A John Doe who has likely been drinking his liver away for 30 years. He's a Gomer. Get him out of my ER." "A what?" the young resident asked, confused. "Get out of my emergency room," Thorne clarified coldly. "Stabilize him enough for transport and ship him to County General. They deal with the indigent. St. Jude is a private facility." "County is 20 minutes away in this weather," Elara said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You are signing his death certificate." Thorne stepped into Elara's personal space. The smell of his expensive cologne clashed violently with the metallic scent of blood. "I am the attending surgeon, Vance. You are a nurse. If you question my triage protocol again, you won't just be fired. I will ensure you never wash a bedpan in this state again." He turned to the residents, clapping his hands. "Move him. Hallway bed until transport arrives. Scrub down this bay. If Councilman Sterling's daughter sees a homeless corpse when she rolls in, heads will roll." Thorne spun on his heel and marched out to greet the VIP helicopter. The room fell silent. The residents looked at each other, terrified, then began to unhook the monitors to move the patient. "Stop," Elara said. The residents froze. Elara looked down at the man. His breathing was shallow, rapid, and wet. He was drowning in his own blood. Thorne saw a statistic. Thorne saw a drunk. But Elara saw the hands. Amidst the filth and the grime, she noticed the man's right hand. It was calloused, scarred, and trembling slightly even in unconsciousness. But it wasn't the tremor of an alcoholic. It was something else. And on the side of his neck, revealed where she had cut the collar of his shirt, was a faint, jagged line of pale skin, an old shrapnel scar, healed badly. This man had been stitched up in a hurry, a long time ago. "Move him to the isolation room," Elara ordered the residents, her voice leaving no room for argument. "But Dr. Thorne said the hallway," the resident stammered. "Dr. Thorne isn't here," Elara said, her eyes flashing. "The hallway is freezing. If we move him there, he goes into shock and dies. Move him to isolation room 4. It's technically not a trauma bay, so Thorne won't care. Do it." They obeyed. As they wheeled the dying man away, Elara grabbed a fresh trauma kit. She wasn't going to let this man die, because a rich girl bumped her head. The storm outside was raging, but the real war had just begun inside St. Jude. Isolation room 4 was less a medical bay and more a closet with a gurney. It was cold, tucked away in the furthest corner of the emergency department, usually reserved for patients with contagious airborne diseases, or in the unspoken hierarchy of St. Jude Hospital. those the administration simply wanted to hide. The storm outside battered the small, high window, rattling the glass in its frame. Inside, the only light came from the erratic flickering of an old cardiac monitor and the harsh beam of Elara's pen light. "Keep the door closed, Toby," Elara ordered, her voice low and urgent. Dr. Toby Miller stood with his back against the heavy wooden door, his eyes wide behind his fogged glasses. He looked like a sentry who had never held a weapon. "Nurse Vance, Elara, if Thorne catches us, my residency is over." He said to wait for transport. "Transport isn't coming in a blizzard, Toby, and this man doesn't have time to wait for a hearse." Elara moved to the head of the gurney. The patient, Elias Rook, though to the hospital he was still just a dirty, inconvenient John Doe, was fading. His skin had turned a terrifying shade of ash gray beneath the grime. His breathing was a wet, shallow rasp, like a drowning man fighting for air through a straw. Elara grabbed the trauma shears from her pocket. The serrated blades gleamed under the penlight. She didn't hesitate. She jammed the blunt tip under the collar of the man's matted flannel shirt and squeezed. The sound of thick, wet fabric tearing was loud in the small room. She cut down the center, peeling back layers of wool, cotton, and filth that had likely not been removed in months. The smell of old sweat, cheap whiskey, and infection bloomed in the air, pungent and heavy. Toby gagged slightly, covering his nose with his sleeve, but Elara didn't flinch. She stripped the fabric away, revealing the man's chest. It was a road map of violence. The bruising from the car accident was fresh, a deep, angry purple spanning the right side of his rib cage. The ribs were clearly broken, moving paradoxically. When he inhaled, that section of his chest collapsed inward. Flail chest. But it was what lay beneath the fresh trauma that made Elara stop. Scar tissue. A jagged, raised keloid scar ran from his shoulder to his sternum. It was old, decades old. And resting against that scar, tangled in the mat of gray chest hair, was a necklace. It wasn't gold or silver. It was a ball chain, black with oxidation. Elara reached out, her gloved fingers brushing the cold metal. She pulled the object free. 2 metal tags clinked together. They were rusted around the edges, battered and worn smooth by time and anxious fingers, but the stamped lettering was still legible. Rook Elias, USMC 037, no pref. "He's not a drunk," Elara whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. She traced the USMC with her thumb. "He's a scout sniper, a Marine." "What?" Toby stepped away from the door, squinting at the tags. "Look at the scarring," Elara said, her voice tightening. "That's shrapnel, high velocity. This man survived a war only to get crushed by a delivery truck in Boston." Suddenly, the rhythm of the monitor changed. The steady beep-beep accelerated into a frantic, high-pitched alarm. "Beep, beep, beep, beep." "He's crashing," Toby yelped, rushing to the monitor. "Tachycardia. Heart rate is 140. BP is plummeting. 60/30. Elara dropped the tags and placed her hands on the patient's chest. It was hard as a rock. The right side wasn't moving at all anymore. She looked at his neck. The jugular veins were bulging out, rope-like and distended, struggling to push blood back into a heart that was being squeezed to death. She placed 2 fingers on his trachea. It had shifted. Instead of being centered, it was pushed aggressively to the left. "Tension pneumothorax," Elara hissed. "The broken ribs punctured the lung. Air is leaking into the chest cavity every time he breathes, but it has nowhere to go. It's building up pressure, crushing his heart and the other lung." "We need a chest tube," Toby shouted, panic pitching his voice an octave higher. I'll go find a resident to put one in." "No time," Elara said, grabbing a stethoscope. She listened for a split second, silence on the right. "Obstructive shock. His heart is going to stop in less than a minute. We need to decompress him. Now." "Vance!" The door to the isolation room swung open, banging hard against Toby's shoulder. He stumbled forward, nearly tripping over the IV stand. Dr. Julian Thorne stood in the doorway. He wasn't alone. 2 other nurses stood behind him, looking terrified. Thorne's face was a mask of cold fury. The noise of the alarms had drawn him from the VIP suite. "What is this noise?" Thorne demanded, stepping into the cramped room. I gave a direct order to keep this hallway clear and quiet. Councilman Sterling's daughter is being prepped for imaging, and I can hear this racket from the other end of the ward." "Dr. Thorne," Elara said, not stepping away from the patient. She looked him dead in the eye. "Patient has a tension pneumothorax. Trachea is deviated. Jugular distension is critical. He is going into cardiac arrest." Thorne looked at the exposed chest of the homeless man, then at the dog tags hanging around his neck. He didn't see a hero. He saw a liability. He saw a lawsuit waiting to happen if a nurse played cowboy with a dying vagrant. "He is dead, Vance," Thorne said coldly. "Look at the monitor. That's a dying heart. You are wasting resources and you are disobeying my orders." "He is not dead," Elara shouted, her voice cracking the professional veneer she wore like armor. "He is suffocating. If we insert a needle, we relieve the pressure. It takes 10 seconds. And who is going to do that?" Thorne stepped closer, looming over her. "You, a nurse? You are not qualified to perform invasive surgical procedures. Step away from the patient, turn off the monitor, call the time of death." "Beep!" The monitor flatlined. "PE!" Toby whispered, horrified. "Pulseless electrical activity. The heart is trying to beat, but there's no room." "Time of death." Thorne checked his Rolex. 3:22 a.m. "No," Elara said. She didn't think. She moved. She spun to the crash cart behind her. Her hand bypassed the adrenaline, bypassed the intubation kit. She grabbed the orange hub needle, a 14-gauge angio cath. It was thick, long, and designed for rapid fluid resuscitation, but in the right hands, it was a key to unlock a pressurized chest. "Vance, put that down," Thorne barked, his voice losing its smooth composure. Elara ignored him. She turned back to Elias Rook. She located the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, 2 ribs down from the collarbone. "I said stop!" Thorne roared. He lunged. He didn't grab her arm to stop the procedure. He didn't shove her shoulder. He grabbed the back of her head. His fingers tangled into her tight bun, gripping her hair with a violence that shocked the entire room. He yanked her head back, using her hair as a lever. "You insolent bitch!" Thorne screamed. He slammed her head forward. Elara's forehead connected with the sharp metal edge of the stainless steel instrument table next to the gurney. Crack. The sound was sickening. It was the sound of skin splitting and bone meeting steel. Elara crumpled. She dropped to one knee, the world spinning into a kaleidoscope of white light and pain. Blood, warm and fast, began to pour down her forehead, blinding her left eye. "Oh my God!" one of the nurses in the hallway screamed. Toby stood frozen, his mouth open, unable to process the brutality he had just witnessed. Thorne stood over Elara, breathing heavily, his face twisted into an ugly snarl. He looked at his hand, then at the blood dripping onto the pristine floor. For a second, he looked surprised by his own violence, but the arrogance quickly flooded back to cover the fear. "I told you," Thorne spat, wiping his hand on his lab coat as if he had touched something filthy. "I forbid you from touching my patient. You are finished here, Vance. Get security. Get this trash out of my hospital." Elara knelt on the floor, one hand on the ground to steady herself. The needle had fallen from her grip, clattering under the gurney. The blood dripped from her nose, painting red circles on the linoleum. The room was silent, save for the continuous haunting drone of the flatline. Beep! Thorne turned his back on her, reaching for the monitor to silence the alarm. "Dr. Miller," he said to the petrified intern, "call the morgue." But Elara wasn't looking at Thorne. Through the curtain of blood and the ringing in her ears, she was looking at the floor. She was looking at the needle. The world narrowed down to a single throbbing point of heat in the center of Elara's forehead. Time didn't stop, but it warped. It stretched and distorted like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. For Dr. Julian Thorne, the seconds following the blow were filled with a rush of adrenaline and the ugly satisfaction of dominance. For Toby Miller, frozen against the wall, they were a nightmare played in slow motion. But for Elara Vance, the seconds were a reset button. She was on one knee, her head bowed. A thick, warm droplet of blood gathered at the bridge of her nose, heavy and dark. It hesitated for a fraction of a second before falling. Drip. It hit the white linoleum floor, a perfect circle of red. Elara stared at it. The shape was familiar. She had seen that color on the sand in Kandahar. She had seen it on the deck of a medevac chopper. She had seen it on her brother's uniform. The pain should have been blinding. The metal table had likely split the skin down to the periosteum. A normal person would be clutching their head, sobbing, or curling into a fetal position from the shock. But Elara wasn't normal. As the pain flooded her nervous system, a switch in her brain, one that had been rusted shut for 5 years, suddenly slammed into the on position. The quiet nurse vanished. The submissive head-down woman who changed bedpans and took verbal abuse was gone. In the vacuum she left behind, the ghost returned. Elara's breathing shifted. It wasn't the tactical breathing of anxiety management anymore. It was the deep, rhythmic intake of a predator preparing to kill. Her pupils dilated, overriding the concussion symptoms, drinking in every detail of the room. She saw the position of Thorne's feet. She saw the unprotected angle of his neck. She saw the needle lying 6 inches from her left knee. Pathetic, Thorne sneered, mistaking her silence for submission. He loomed over her, adjusting his cuffs, his confidence swelling like a toxic balloon. This is what happens when you forget your place, Vance. You're fired. Get out of my sight before I have you arrested for endangerment. Elara didn't move. She just watched the blood drip again. Drip. Did you hear me? Thorne's voice rose, shrill and impatient. He reached out again, his hand open, aiming for her shoulder to shove her toward the door. I said, ghetto! Elara moved. It wasn't a movement the human eye could track easily. It was an explosion of kinetic energy. As Thorne's hand descended, Elara didn't cower. She surged upward. Her left hand shot out, not to block, but to intercept. She caught Thorne's wrist in midair. Her grip was iron, fingers digging into the sensitive pressure points between the tendons. Thorne gasped, his eyes widening in confusion. What do you... Elara didn't speak. She stepped in, invading his center of gravity. She twisted his wrist outward, rotating the joint against its natural range of motion. At the same time, she drove her shoulder into his chest. Physics took over. Thorne, 6 feet tall and built like a gym rat, was helpless against the leverage. He spun like a top, his balance destroyed. Elara swept his lead leg with her foot, and the chief surgeon went down. Thud. The impact shook the room. Thorne hit the floor face first, the air rushing out of his lungs in a pained wheeze. Before he could scramble up, Elara was on him. She dropped her weight, driving her knee into the center of his back, right between the shoulder blades. She pulled his right arm, his surgical arm, up behind his back, twisting it to the breaking point. Ah, my arm! You're breaking my arm! Thorne shrieked, his face pressed against the cold tiles, right next to the blood Elara had shed. The room was deathly silent. The nurses in the hallway covered their mouths. Toby Miller stopped breathing. Elara leaned down. Her lips were inches from Thorne's ear. Her blood dripped from her forehead onto his pristine white lab coat, staining it with the evidence of his crime. Quiet, she whispered. The word was soft, but it carried the weight of a tombstone. You are assaulting a superior, Thorne spat, trying to buck her off. I will destroy you. I am a surgeon. My hands are insured for millions. Elara increased the pressure on his wrist by a millimeter. Thorne screamed again, a high-pitched, humiliating sound. Listen to me closely, doctor, Elara said, her voice flat, devoid of anger, devoid of humanity. I know exactly how much pressure it takes to snap the radius in ulna. I know how to sever the median nerve so you will never hold a scalpel again. I can end your career in less than a second. Thorne went rigid. He stopped struggling. The threat wasn't a bluff. He could feel the lethal precision in her grip. For the first time in his life, Julian Thorne felt true, primal terror. Stay. Down. Elara didn't release him. She kept him pinned with her knee in one hand. With her free left hand, she reached out. Her eyes scanned the floor. There. The 14-gauge angio-cath. She snatched it up. Toby! Elara barked. The name cracked like a whip. The intern jumped, his glasses nearly falling off. Yes? Monitor, call it out. Toby scrambled to the cardiac machine, his hands shaking so hard he could barely touch the screen. Still flatline. Pia, no pulse. Not for long, Elara muttered. She looked at the patient, Elias Rook. He was gray, lifeless. The pressure in his chest was a ticking time bomb that had already hit 0. She couldn't move him. She couldn't stand up to get a better angle because if she let Thorne up, he would interfere. She had to do it from the floor, one-handed, blind. Elara closed her eyes for a heartbeat. She visualized the anatomy. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, just above the third rib. She opened her eyes. She leaned forward, stretching her left arm across the pinned body of the surgeon. "Don't move," she hissed at Thorne, pressing his face harder into the floor. She positioned the needle over Elias's chest. Her hand, smeared with her own blood, was rock steady. She didn't have the luxury of slow insertion. She needed force. She drove the needle down. It punched through the tough, weather-beaten skin. It punched through the intercostal muscle. Pop! She felt the give as the needle entered the pleural cavity. And then, the sound. Hiss! It was the loudest sound in the room. A rush of pressurized air escaped through the catheter, sounding like a tire valve being opened. It was the sound of death leaving the body. Elara pulled the needle out, leaving the plastic catheter in place. "Toby, check pulse!" Toby pressed his fingers to Elias's carotid artery. He waited. 1 second, 2 seconds. Beep. The monitor on the wall woke up. A single, lonely green spike. Beep. Beep. "I have a pulse," Toby yelled, his voice cracking with disbelief. "It's weak, but it's there. Sinus rhythm returning. Oxygen saturation is coming up. 70, 75. Elara didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. She simply watched the numbers climb. 80%, Toby breathed. "He's back. You brought him back." Only then did Elara release the pressure on Thorne's arm. She stood up slowly, her knees cracking. She wiped the blood from her eye with the back of her hand, smearing a red streak across her cheek like war paint. Thorne scrambled away from her like a crab, clutching his wrist, his face purple with rage and humiliation. He backed into the hallway, gasping for air. "You?" Thorne pointed a shaking finger at her. "Security! Security! Arrest her! She's crazy!" 2 uniformed hospital security guards came running down the corridor, their hands on their belts. They saw the scene, the chief surgeon cowering on the floor, the blood on the tiles, and the small nurse standing over him with a plastic needle casing in her hand. Elara didn't run. She didn't fight. She dropped the needle casing into the biohazard bin with a clack. She turned to Toby. "Bag him. Keep his saturation above 90. Don't let anyone remove that catheter until he's in a real trauma bay." I will," Toby nodded, looking at her with something approaching awe. Elara turned to face the guards. She held her hands out in front of her, wrists together. Her face was impassive. The ghost had done her job. The mission was complete. "I'm right here," she said calmly to the guards. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, cold, heavy metal biting into her skin, Elara didn't look at Thorne. She looked past him, at the monitor in the room. Beep, beep, beep. Elias Rook was alive. And for Elara Vance, that was the only victory that mattered. The arrival of the authorities was a cacophony of heavy boots and squawking radios that shattered the stunned silence of the emergency room. It wasn't just hospital security this time. 2 Boston police officers, shaking snow from their heavy tactical jackets, burst through the double doors, their hands resting instinctively near their holsters. "Where is she?" the lead officer barked, scanning the room. Dr. Julian Thorne was already standing. He had smoothed his hair and straightened his lab coat, though nothing could hide the red, angry fingerprints bruising his wrist or the smear of blood on his pristine white sleeve. He pointed a trembling finger at Elara. "There," Thorne said, his voice regaining its practiced aristocratic smooth. "That woman, she is psychotic. She assaulted me and performed an illegal invasive procedure on a patient against direct orders." The officers moved in. To them, the scene was clear. A distinguished surgeon pointing out a perpetrator. They didn't see the needle on the floor or the steady rhythm on the heart monitor. They saw a small woman in scrubs standing over a wealthy doctor. "Ma'am, turn around," the officer ordered, approaching Elara cautiously. "Hands behind your back." Elara didn't argue. She didn't plead her case or point to the life she had just saved. She knew the protocol. In her previous life, she had been the one putting the cuffs on high-value targets. She knew that resisting now would only give Thorne more ammunition. She slowly turned, presenting her wrists. "I am compliant," Elara said softly. The officer grabbed her wrists roughly, twisting them behind her back. Click, click. The sound of the steel ratchets tightening was sharp and final. The cold metal bit into her skin, pressing against the ulnar nerve, but Elara's face remained a mask of stone. As the officer jerked her forward to march her out, the sudden motion dislodged something from the deep pocket of her scrub top. It was a small, laminated photograph, no larger than a playing card. It fluttered silently through the air, drifting down like a leaf, and landed face down under the edge of the gurney. In the commotion, the officers shouting, Thorne barking orders at the nurses, no one noticed it fall, not even Elara. "Get her out of here," Thorne hissed as they dragged her past him. "And make sure the district attorney knows I want maximum charges. Assault with a deadly weapon. Attempted manslaughter." Elara stopped for a fraction of a second as she passed him. She didn't look at Thorne. She looked at the monitor displaying Elias Rook's heartbeat. 72 beats per minute. Steady. She looked at Toby Miller, the terrified intern cowering by the crash cart. She gave him a microscopic nod. "Hold the line." Then she was gone. The heavy doors swung shut behind her, leaving a vacuum of silence in the room. Thorne took a deep breath, adjusting his tie. He looked around the room, his eyes daring anyone to speak. The nurses looked away, busying themselves with charts. The security guards retreated to their posts. Thorne had re-established his kingdom. He turned his attention to the gurney, to Elias Rook. The old man was alive. The chest tube Elara had improvised was working perfectly, the air hissing gently as his lung re-expanded. To any other doctor, this would be a miracle. To Julian Thorne, it was an insult. The rhythmic beeping of the monitor was a constant reminder that a nurse had succeeded where he had refused to try. Thorne walked to the counter and snatched up a transfer form. He uncapped his fountain pen, the gold nib glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Dr. Miller," Thorne said, not looking up from the paper. Toby jumped. Yes, sir?" "Prepare the patient for immediate transfer," Thorne said, his pen scratching loudly across the paper. Toby blinked, confused. "Transfer?" "Sir, he's unstable. The chest tube is makeshift. We need to get him to the OR to insert a proper drain and plate the ribs. If we move him now—" "St. Jude is a private medical facility, Dr. Miller." Thorne cut him off, his voice dripping with bureaucratic venom. "We do not have the bed space for uninsured indigent John Does. His condition is stable enough." "Stable enough?" Toby looked at the blizzard raging against the window. "Sir, it's a whiteout out there. The ambulances are moving at 10 miles an hour. A transfer to County General will take 45 minutes. In his condition, the vibration alone will dislodge that catheter. He'll suffocate before he crosses the river." Thorne stopped writing. He looked up, his eyes cold and dead. "Are you questioning my triage assessment, intern?" Thorne asked softly. "Because the last person who did that is currently in the back of a squad car. Do you want to join her? Do you want to explain to your parents why their tuition money was wasted because you couldn't follow a simple administrative protocol?" Toby's mouth went dry. He thought of his student loans. He thought of the years of sleepless nights studying. He looked at Thorne, a man who could end his career with a phone call. "No, sir," Toby whispered, looking at his shoes. "Good." Thorne ripped the top sheet off the form and slapped it onto Elias's chest. "Call the transport team. Get this filth out of here. I want this room sterilized for Councilman Sterling's daughter by the time she gets out of imaging." Thorne turned and swept out of the room, his lab coat billowing behind him like a cape, leaving the scent of expensive cologne to mask the smell of antiseptic and fear. Toby stood alone in the silence. The shame burned in his gut, hot and acidic. He was a coward. He had become a doctor to save lives, and now he was about to be an accomplice to a murder by paperwork. He walked over to the gurney to prep Elias for the transport that would kill him. As he bent down to unlock the wheels, something caught his eye, a splash of color on the white floor. Toby reached down and picked it up. It was the photograph Elara had dropped. He turned it over. It was an old picture, slightly faded. It showed a young woman, Elara, but with a smile he had never seen, bright and unburdened. Her arm was draped around the shoulders of a young man in a Marine Corps uniform. They were laughing, squinting into the sun. The young man looked just like her. On the back, in neat, cramped handwriting, was written, Jamie and Elara, Kandahar, 2018. Come home safe. Toby stared at the picture. He looked at the smile on Elara's face, a smile that the war and this hospital had stolen from her. She had saved this old man because she couldn't save her brother. She had thrown away her career, her freedom, maybe her life, for a stranger. And Toby? He was worried about his student loans. He looked at the transfer order on Elias's chest. Immediate transfer. Physician approval. J. Thorne. Toby looked at the window. The snow was slamming against the glass, a wall of white death. No, Toby whispered. His hands were shaking, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from anger. He crumbled the transfer order into a ball and shoved it into his pocket. He looked around. The hallway was empty. The nurses were distracted by the arrival of the VIP patient in the main trauma bay. Sorry, Mr. Rook, Toby whispered to the unconscious Marine. We're going on a little detour. He unlocked the wheels of the gurney. Instead of pushing it toward the ambulance bay, Toby turned the gurney toward the dark, less used corridor that led to the basement levels. He moved fast, his heart hammering against his ribs. He pushed Elias past the linen closets, past the break room, until he reached a set of double doors marked with heavy red warning tape. Infectious Disease Isolation Unit, Biohazard, Authorized Personnel Only. The unit was currently closed for renovation, used only for storage of old equipment. It was effectively a ghost town. Toby swiped his keycard. The light blinked red. Access denied. Interns didn't have clearance. Come on, Toby hissed, swiping again. Come on! Red. He heard footsteps approaching from the main hallway. Someone was coming. Toby looked at the keypad. He remembered seeing David, the charge nurse, punch in the override code a week ago. 1984. He punched the numbers. Click. Green light. Toby shoved the gurney inside and let the heavy doors seal shut behind them just as the footsteps passed by outside. The room was pitch black until the motion sensors flickered on. It was dusty and smelled of ozone, but it was warm, and more importantly, it was off the grid. Toby parked the gurney next to an oxygen outlet. He quickly hooked Elias up to the wall supply, checking the vitals. The old man was holding on. Toby grabbed a marker from his pocket and a piece of paper from a nearby desk. He wrote in large block letters, Quarantine, suspected meningococcal meningitis. Do not enter without hazmat gear. He cracked the door and taped the sign to the outside, then locked it again from the inside. He slid down the wall, sitting on the floor next to Elias Rook. He pulled the photograph of Elara and Jamie out of his pocket. I don't know who you are, sir, Toby said to the unconscious man, his voice trembling. But the ghost just went to jail for you, so you'd better not die on me now. He checked his watch. He had bought maybe 2 hours before Thorne realized the patient wasn't on the transport manifest. 2 hours to figure out how to save a man that the most powerful doctor in the city wanted dead. Toby Miller took a deep breath. For the first time, he didn't feel like an intern. He felt like a conspirator. The interrogation room at the 4th Precinct was a box of cinder blocks painted a depressing shade of institutional beige. It smelled of stale coffee and despair. Elara Vance sat at the metal table, her left wrist cuffed to the steel ring bolt in the center. She sat with perfect posture, her back straight, her hands resting calmly on the table. She stared at the two-way mirror, seeing her own reflection, the bruise on her forehead now blooming into a violent purple-black, her scrub top stained with her own blood, and Dr. Thorne's sweat. Detective Sullivan sat across from her. He was a man who looked like he had been slowly eroded by 20 years of bad cases. He rubbed his temples, looking at the file in front of him. Look, Ms. Vance, Sullivan sighed, pushing a paper cup of water toward her. I'm trying to help you here. Dr. Thorne is pressing for felony assault, battery, and practicing medicine without a license. That's 10 years, easy. But the DA might be lenient if you plead mental distress. We know you're a veteran. We can get you into a diversion program. Elara didn't touch the water. I don't need a diversion program detective. You need a lawyer, Sullivan countered. I can call the public defender. I don't want a lawyer, Elara said, her voice steady. I want my phone call. Sullivan groaned. He had been trying to get her to talk for an hour, but she was a stone wall. Fine, one call, make it count. He slid an old landline phone across the table and punched a code to get an outside line. Elara picked up the receiver. She didn't dial a local Boston area code. She didn't dial a family member. She dialed a number that Sullivan didn't recognize, a sequence of digits that seemed too long to be standard. She waited. One ring, two rings, click. Secure line, identify. A computerized voice spoke on the other end. Authorization Alpha 9 Sierra, Elara said, her eyes locked on Sullivan's confused face. Code black, asset 1, location, Boston PD, precinct 4. She hung up. Sullivan stared at her. Who was that? A boyfriend? Elara leaned back in her chair. You might want to get some coffee, detective. It's going to be a very loud night. Meanwhile, in the bowels of St. Jude Hospital, time was moving differently. The infectious disease isolation unit was essentially a glorified storage closet with a ventilation system, but it was warm. Toby Miller sat on the floor, his legs cramped, watching the rise and fall of Elias Rook's chest. He wasn't alone. Nurse Sarah, a veteran of the ER with 20 years of experience, had slipped in 10 minutes ago. She had seen Toby wheeling the gurney down the dark corridor and had followed him, not to report him, but to hand him a bag of supplies she had stolen from the trauma bay. You're crazy, Toby, Sarah whispered, checking the drainage on Elias's chest tube. Thorne is going to skin you alive. Thorne can go to hell, Toby muttered, adjusting the flow of oxygen. We need to clean him up. If infection sets in, the chest tube won't matter. Sarah nodded. Together, they began the grim task of cutting away the rest of Elias's filthy, ruined clothing. They worked in silence, the only sound the hiss of the oxygen tank. The smell was overpowering, a mix of old sweat, street grime, and dried blood. Sarah took the trauma shears to the thick, heavy wool coat Elias wore. It was 3 sizes too big, likely scavenged from a dumpster years ago. This coat weighs 50 pounds, Sarah grunted, struggling to peel the wet wool away from the man's side. Wait, there's something sewn into the lining. Toby looked up. What? Here. Sarah pointed to the inside of the left breast pocket. The lining had been ripped and carefully restitched with dental floss, creating a hidden compartment deep inside the padding. It feels hard. A flask, maybe? Toby reached in. He felt a small, rectangular box. It was wrapped in layers of plastic grocery bags to keep it dry. He pulled it out. The plastic crinkled loudly in the small room. He unwrapped layer after layer, revealing a battered dark blue velvet box. The velvet was worn bald in places, but the gold lettering on the lid was still faintly visible. United States of America. Toby's breath hitched. He looked at Sarah. Her eyes were wide. Open it, she whispered. Toby flipped the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of white satin, was a medal. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a star, a gold 5-pointed star, surrounded by a wreath of green laurel. It hung from a light blue ribbon pad with 13 white stars. The Medal of Honor. The room seemed to shrink. The air felt heavier. This wasn't just a military decoration. This was the highest and most prestigious military decoration that could be awarded to recognize U.S. military service members for acts of valor. Oh my God, Sarah breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. Do you know what this is? I know, Toby whispered. He looked down at the unconscious, dirty man on the gurney, the man Thorne had called trash, the man they were hiding in a closet like a criminal. Toby reached into the box and pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper tucked underneath the medal. It was a citation. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, Sergeant Elias Rook held a strategic hill alone for 12 hours against an enemy battalion, sustaining multiple injuries, refusing evacuation until all his men were safe. Toby looked at the date, 1971, Vietnam. He's not a vagrant, Toby said, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and awe. He's a national hero. He's a legend. Sarah gently touched the man's hand. "And we were about to let him die in a transport van." "No," Toby said, standing up. He carefully closed the box and placed it on Elias's chest, right over his heart. "We aren't hiding anymore. Sarah, stay with him. I'm going to find a phone. I don't care who Thorne calls. I'm calling the news." Back at the 4th Precinct, Detective Sullivan was pouring his 3rd cup of coffee when the coffee in his cup began to ripple. Boom! A low vibration shook the floorboards. Sullivan frowned. "Subway running late tonight?" Boom! The 2nd vibration rattled the window pane in the interrogation room. It wasn't a train. It was rhythmic. It was getting louder. Thwup, 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 thwup. The sound of rotors. Not one helicopter. Many. "What the hell?" Sullivan walked to the window and pulled the blinds. He dropped his coffee cup. The street outside the precinct, usually quiet at this hour, was flooded with blinding white searchlights. But they weren't police lights. A massive armored vehicle, a Bearcat, painted matte black, roared around the corner, crushing a parked city bicycle under its tires without slowing down. Behind it, 2 black SUVs screeched to a halt, blocking the precinct's main entrance. Overhead, the roar was deafening. A MH-60 Black Hawk helicopter was hovering low, dangerously low, right above the street, its downdraft kicking up a whirlwind of snow and trash. Ropes dropped from the skids. "We're under attack!" a uniformed officer screamed from the main desk. "Nobody move!" Sullivan yelled, reaching for his weapon but not drawing it. "Lock the doors!" The front doors of the precinct didn't need to be unlocked. They were blown open. Crash! The glass shattered inward. Smoke grenades rolled across the lobby floor, filling the room with thick gray haze. "Federal agents! Weapons down! Hands where we can see them!" The voices were amplified, distorted by gas masks. 6 figures in full tactical gear, multicam uniforms, night vision goggles flipped up, suppressed carbines held at the low ready, swept into the room. They moved with a fluidity that made the police officers look like amateurs. "Don't shoot!" Sullivan yelled, throwing his hands up. "We are Boston PD. Identify yourselves." The tactical team ignored him. They fanned out, securing the perimeter in seconds. Then the smoke cleared slightly. A man walked through the shattered doors. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He was wearing a dress uniform, army green. The ribbons on his chest were stacked so high they reached his shoulder. 4 silver stars glistened on his epaulets. General Marcus Keaton, commander of U.S. Special Operations Command, walked into the dingy police station like he owned the building. He scanned the room, his eyes like flint. "Who is the watch commander?" Sullivan stepped forward, his voice shaking. I am the ranking detective. Who are you? You can't just bust into a civilian precinct." General Keaton ignored the question. He walked straight past Sullivan toward the interrogation room. He knew exactly where she was. "Open it," Keaton ordered the soldier next to him. The soldier didn't use a key. He used a battering ram to pop the lock on the interrogation room door. The door swung open. Elara was still sitting there, handcuffed to the table. She hadn't flinched when the flashbangs went off. She hadn't moved when the door burst open. She just looked up. General Keaton stepped into the small room. The space was suddenly too small for the two of them. Sullivan ran up behind the general. "Now wait a minute. That woman is a suspect in a felony assault. She is in my custody." Keaton turned slowly. He looked at Sullivan with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Detective," Keaton said, his voice deep and gravelly. "The woman in this chair is not a suspect. She is a ghost." Keaton turned back to Elara. He stood at attention. Slowly, deliberately, the 4-star general raised his right hand to his brow in a sharp, perfect salute. "Major Vance," Keaton said softly. Elara looked at him. For the first time all night, her mask slipped. Her eyes softened. She stood up, the chain of the handcuffs rattling. She returned the salute as best she could with her hands bound. "General," she replied. "Uncuff her," Keaton ordered, not looking back. "I can't do that," Sullivan protested. "She broke a surgeon's skull." "Son," Keaton said, leaning in close to Sullivan, "Major Elara Vance is the only surviving member of Operation Cinder. She is a Tier 1 asset with the highest security clearance in the United States military. She has saved more lives in one tour than you will in a lifetime. If she broke a surgeon's skull, I can guarantee you he deserved it." Keaton pointed to the cuffs. "Now, get them off, or I will have you arrested for obstruction of national security." Sullivan fumbled for his keys. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped them twice. As the cuffs clicked open and Elara rubbed her wrists, Keaton handed her a jacket he had been carrying, a black bomber jacket with no insignia. "We received your distress call," Keaton said. "The extraction team is spun up, but we have a problem." "Elias Rook," Elara said immediately. "He's at the hospital." "We know," Keaton nodded grimly. "And so does the press, but we aren't leaving until you tell us the mission parameters." Elara zipped up the jacket. She looked at the general, the fire returning to her eyes. "The mission is simple, General," Elara said. "We are going to take back that hospital." The grand atrium of St. Jude Hospital was designed to intimidate. It was a cathedral of glass and polished marble, soaring 4 stories high, with a waterfall cascading down one wall to provide a soothing, white noise backdrop to the business of saving lives, or in this case, the business of saving reputations. Outside, the blizzard was still raging, burying Boston in white silence. Inside, the air was hot with the friction of 100 camera shutters. A podium had been erected in front of the waterfall. Behind it stood the hospital board, a phalanx of grim-faced men and women in expensive suits. But the man at the center commanded the room. Sterling Thorne, chairman of the board and father to Julian, looked like a silver-haired shark. He was 60, tan despite the New England winter, with eyes that possessed the cold, dead flat affect of a man who viewed human suffering as a line item on a spreadsheet. He gripped the podium, his voice projected through the high-end sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press," Sterling began, his voice a practiced baritone of somber concern. "We pride ourselves on being a sanctuary, but tonight that sanctuary was violated." He gestured to his right. Dr. Julian Thorne stepped forward. He had changed into a fresh lab coat, his hair restyled, but he wore a soft cast on his wrist, a prop to garner sympathy. He looked pale, playing the part of the victimized healer to perfection. "Thank you, Father," Julian said, leaning into the microphones. He looked out at the sea of reporters from CNN, Fox, and the Boston Globe. Earlier tonight, a temporary nurse, suffering from an acute psychotic break, likely induced by untreated PTSD, infiltrated our trauma unit. She assaulted me, endangered a critical patient, and threatened the safety of my staff. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Pens scratched furiously on notepads. "We are currently cooperating with the authorities to ensure this dangerous individual, Major Elara Vance, is prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law," Julian continued, his voice gaining strength. "St. Jude has zero tolerance for violence. We are victims here." High above the atrium floor, in the glass-walled control booth overlooking the lobby, Toby Miller was sweating. "Are we in?" Toby whispered, his hands gripping the back of the swivel chair. Sitting in the chair wasn't a hospital security guard. It was Warrant Officer Diaz, a 20-something military cyber warfare specialist, with purple-streaked hair tucked under her headset and fingers that moved across a keyboard like a pianist playing Rachmaninoff. She had entered the building with General Keaton's team, ghosting past security while the heavy hitters went for the front door. "St. Jude's firewalls are expensive," Diaz muttered, chewing gum aggressively. But their internal AV network password was admin123. Pathetic. "I'm bypassing the feed. Now." Down on the floor, Julian was reaching his crescendo. "This nurse is a stain on the medical profession. She is a criminal who..." Scree. A high-pitched shriek of audio feedback cut through the atrium, causing everyone to cover their ears. Julian flinched, looking back at the massive 4K LED screen that usually displayed donor names and soothing landscapes behind him. The screen flickered, the image of a tranquil forest dissolved into static. "Technical difficulties," Sterling hissed to an aide. "Cut the power, now!" But it was too late. The static cleared. A grainy, high-contrast black and white image filled the 20-foot screen. It was security footage. The timestamp in the corner read, "Today, 03:22 a.m. The room went deathly silent. On the screen, the scene played out in high definition. The reporters saw the homeless man gasping for air. They saw Elara pleading, and then they saw Dr. Julian Thorne. They watched as he ignored the dying man. They watched as he lunged. The audio from the security camera had been enhanced by Diaz. It boomed through the atrium speakers, louder than Julian's lies. "You insolent bitch!" The slap echoed like a gunshot. The audience gasped as one collective organism. They watched the chief surgeon of St. Jude wrap his hand into the nurse's hair and slam her head into the metal table. They saw the blood spray. Julian Thorne froze at the podium, his face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray. He looked up at the screen, watching his own brutality played back on a loop. "Turn it off!" Sterling screamed, losing his composure. He waved his arms at the control booth. "Cut the feed! This is a fabrication, a deep fake." "It looks real enough to me, Mr. Thorne." The deep voice did not come from the speakers. It came from the main entrance. The revolving doors stopped spinning. The crowd of reporters parted like the Red Sea, turning their cameras away from the podium and toward the back of the room. General Marcus Keaton walked in. He was flanked by 4 MPs carrying carbines at the low ready. But the eyes of the room weren't on the general. They were on the woman walking beside him, Elara Vance. She wasn't in handcuffs. She wasn't wearing scrubs. She wore the black bomber jacket, her hair loose now, framing the dark, ugly bruise on her forehead. She walked with a limp, but her head was high. She looked like a soldier returning from the front lines. Julian Thorne gripped the podium, his knuckles white. You shouldn't be here. You're under arrest." General Keaton stepped up onto the raised platform, ignoring Julian completely. He took the microphone from the stand. "My name is General Marcus Keaton, U.S. Special Operations Command," he announced. The authority in his voice made the expensive suit-wearing board members shrink back. "And I am here to correct the record." Keaton pointed a gloved finger at the frozen image of the homeless man on the screen. Dr. Thorne called this man a vagrant. He called him trash that needed to be disposed of to make room for a VIP. Keaton paused, letting the words hang in the air. "That man," Keaton continued, his voice trembling with suppressed rage, "is Master Sergeant Elias Rook, United States Marine Corps, retired. He is a recipient of the Medal of Honor for Valor in the A-Shau Valley in 1971. He is a national treasure. And you," Keaton turned slowly to look at Julian Thorne, "you left him to die in a hallway because he ruined your aesthetic." The cameras flashed in a blinding strobe, a lightning storm of exposure. Julian opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked at his father for help, but Sterling was staring at the floor, realizing the empire was burning down. "This is a misunderstanding," Sterling tried, his voice weak. "We didn't know—" "Ignorance is not a defense for malpractice," a new voice cut in. From the side entrance, a man in a trench coat walked onto the stage. He was older, with a face carved from granite and eyes that had seen every lie Boston had to offer. It was Police Chief O'Malley. He was followed by 2 uniformed officers. O'Malley didn't look at the cameras. He walked straight up to Julian Thorne. "Dr. Julian Thorne," O'Malley said, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment, and criminal negligence." Julian recoiled. "You can't do this? Do you know who I am? My father?" "Turn around," O'Malley barked. He spun the doctor around and slammed the cuffs on. The sound of the ratchet locking was the sweetest sound Elara had heard all night. "And Sterling Thorne," O'Malley continued, looking at the older man, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and accessory after the fact. We have the transfer orders signed by your son, and we have the testimony of your intern, Dr. Miller." Sterling's face went slack. He looked up to the glass booth. Toby Miller was standing there, looking down. Toby wasn't hiding anymore. He met Sterling's gaze and didn't blink. As the officers began to drag the screaming Julian and the silent Sterling away, Elara stepped forward. The reporters shouted questions at her. "Ms. Vance, how do you feel? Ms. Vance, look this way." Elara ignored them. She walked up to Julian as the officer paused. Julian looked at her. The arrogance was gone. The god complex was shattered. He looked small. He looked like a child who had finally been told no. "You said I was nothing," Elara said softly, her voice barely audible over the din of the atrium. "You said I was just a nurse." She leaned in close, so only he could hear. "You were right about one thing, doctor. I am a nurse, and that means I protect my patients, even from people like you." She stepped back. "Get him out of my sight." The officers hauled the weeping surgeon away. The flashes continued to pop. General Keaton placed a hand on Elara's shoulder. "The chopper is waiting, Major," Keaton said. "Elias is being transferred to Walter Reed. He's stable. He's asking for you." Elara looked at the screen one last time, where the video had paused on the image of her struggling to save a life while Thorne stood by and watched. She looked at the crowd, then at Toby in the booth, who gave her a thumbs up. For the first time in 5 years, the noise in her head, the rotors, the bombs, the screaming, was gone. It was replaced by a profound, heavy silence. "Let's go, General," Elara said. "Mission accomplished." The VIP suite at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center was nothing like the cramped, freezing isolation room at St. Jude. The walls were painted a soft, calming cream, and the large window looked out not onto a blizzard, but onto the manicured grounds of the campus in Bethesda, Maryland. The air smelled of fresh linen and rain, devoid of the sharp chemical tang of antiseptic that Elara had breathed for the last 3 years. Master Sergeant Elias Rook sat in a chair by the window. He was unrecognizable from the man who had been wheeled into the ER 3 days ago. The matted gray beard was gone, shaved clean to reveal a jawline that was still sharp despite his age. His hair was trimmed tight, high and tight, in the regulation cut he had worn for 30 years. The dirt, the grime, and the smell of the streets were washed away. He wore a simple maroon robe, but he sat with the posture of a king on a throne. His chest was heavily bandaged, and a nasal cannula provided a whisper of oxygen, but his eyes, clear, blue, and piercing, were fixed on the door. He knew she was coming. There was a rhythmic knock, 3 sharp raps. "Enter," Elias rumbled. His voice was gravelly, damaged by the tube and the smoke of years past, but it held command. The door opened. Elara Vance stepped inside. She was not wearing the oversized blue scrubs that had served as her camouflage. She was not wearing the black bomber jacket of a covert operator. She was wearing her service dress blues. The uniform was immaculate. The midnight blue coat was tailored perfectly to her frame, the gold braid gleaming under the hospital lights. On her shoulders, the golden oak leaves of a major caught the sun, but it was the ribbons on her chest that told the story. Rows of colorful bars, the silver star, the purple heart with clusters, the soldier's medal. She held her service cap under her left arm. She walked into the room, stopped 6 feet from Elias, and snapped to attention. She didn't speak. She simply held the salute, her hand trembling ever so slightly. Elias looked at her. He looked at the ribbons. He looked at the scar on her forehead, now fading to a dull yellow, the only visible reminder of the night in Boston. Slowly, painfully, Elias pushed himself up from the chair. He ignored the cane resting nearby. He stood on his own 2 feet. He raised his hand, his fingers straightened, and returned the salute. "At ease, Major," Elias said softly. Elara dropped her hand. Her shoulders relaxed, just a fraction. "It's good to see you on your feet, Top." "It's good to be seen, period," Elias chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. He gestured to the empty chair opposite him. "Sit down, Elara. You make me nervous standing there like a plebe." Elara sat. She rested her cap on her knees, her fingers tracing the brim. For a woman who had disarmed a surgeon and defied a general, she looked suddenly unsure of what to say. "The doctors say you'll make a full recovery," Elara said, falling back on medical clinicals. "The lung has reinflated fully. The ribs will take time, but the plating surgery was successful." "I didn't ask about the doctors," Elias said. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I asked about the nurse, the one who risked a court-martial and a prison cell for a washed-up old jarhead." Elara looked down at her hands. "You weren't washed up. You were misplaced." "I was dying," Elias corrected her gently. "I was ready to go. I had made my peace with the cold. But you pulled me back. Why?" Elara looked up. Because it wasn't right, because you were alone. Elias nodded slowly. He reached behind the small pillow on his chair. His movements were slow, deliberate. He pulled out a small object. It was the photograph. Elara's breath hitched. She hadn't seen it since the police station. She thought it was lost in the chaos, swept away by a janitor at St. Jude. That young doctor, Miller, Elias said, looking at the photo. He gave this to me when I woke up. He said you dropped it when they cuffed you. He said you carried it everywhere. He held the photo out to her. Elara reached for it, her fingers brushing against the worn edges. She looked at the image of herself and Jamie, laughing in the desert sun. They looked so young, so invincible. That's Jamie, Elara whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. My brother, he was 19. I know, Elias said. General Keaton told me the file, Operation Cinder. You were the medic, he was the driver, and IED took the lead vehicle. I couldn't save him, Elara said, the confession tumbling out of her, the poison she had held in her heart for 5 years. I saved the squad, I saved the intel officer, I saved the extraction team, but I couldn't save him. He bled out in my hands while I was triaging the captain. I prioritized the mission over my blood. She looked up at Elias, the tears finally spilling over, tracking down her cheeks. I left him, Elias. I let him die. Elias didn't look away. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He leaned forward and took the photo from her hand, placing it gently on the table between them. Then he took both of her hands in his. His palms were rough, calloused, and warm. Look at me, Major, Elias commanded. Elara met his gaze. You didn't leave him, Elias said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. You did your duty, and that boy, that soldier, he knew that. He knew who his sister was. Elias squeezed her hands. When I was in that ER, when I was fading out, I heard you. I heard you fighting for me. I felt you refusing to let go. You think you were saving me to make up for him? Elara nodded, unable to speak. No, Elias shook his head. You saved me because that's who you are. You are a healer, Elara, but you're also a warrior, and warriors carry scars. He released one of her hands and tapped the photo. He died protecting his unit. You lived to protect the rest of us. You honored him, Elara. You honored him by not letting the darkness take you too. Elias sat back, his eyes softening. You paid your debt, Major. You paid it in full. You don't owe Jamie an apology. You owe him a life, a happy one. Elara closed her eyes. She took a shuddering breath. For 5 years, she had been holding her breath, waiting for the punishment she felt she deserved. She had worn the long sleeves to hide the survivor's guilt, to hide the shame of being alive. But now, sitting across from this old man who had walked through the same fire, she felt the weight lift. It didn't disappear. Grief never fully disappears, but it changed. It stopped being an anchor and became a compass. Thank you, Top, Elara whispered. Don't thank me, Elias grunted, reaching for a glass of water. Just promise me one thing. Don't go back to the shadows. The world has enough ghosts. Yaska 3 months later. Spring had finally come to Boston. The snow that had buried the city was a distant memory, replaced by the vibrant green of new leaves and the explosion of cherry blossoms along the Charles River. The air was crisp and sweet, filled with the sound of construction and the laughter of children in the park. In a quiet neighborhood of South Boston, a new brick building stood gleaming in the sunlight. It wasn't a cold glass tower like St. Jude. It was warm, inviting, with large windows and a garden full of wildflowers out front. A crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. There were no news cameras, no flashing lights, no politicians looking for sound bites. The crowd was made up of veterans, men and women in wheelchairs, some with prosthetics, some with scars that couldn't be seen. Standing by the front door was Toby Miller. He wasn't wearing a white coat anymore. He was wearing blue scrubs, but these were different. Embroidered on the chest was a new logo, a caduceus intertwined with a combat rifle. He held a pair of oversized scissors. Ready when you are, boss, Toby smiled, looking at the woman standing next to him. Elara Vance smiled back. She wasn't wearing her uniform today. She was wearing a simple sleeveless white blouse and comfortable work pants. She looked healthy. The dark circles under her eyes were gone. The tension that used to vibrate in her shoulders had vanished. She looked up at the sign above the door. The Jamie Vance Center for Veteran Recovery. "I'm ready," Elara said. She stepped forward. She didn't give a speech. She didn't need to. The doors were open, and inside, there were people waiting to be heard, waiting to be healed by someone who understood their language. She took the scissors from Toby and cut the red ribbon. The crowd cheered, a genuine warm sound that felt like a hug. As the veterans began to file into the center, greeted by Toby and the new staff, including Nurse Sarah, who had quit St. Jude the day after the arrest, Elara paused on the steps. She felt the sun on her skin. It was warm. For years she had covered herself. She had worn thermal shirts in the summer, terrified that if people saw the marks on her skin, they would see the damage in her soul. Elara looked down at her arms. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her hands. She stretched her arms out to the side, embracing the warmth. On her left forearm, visible to the world, was a long, jagged scar from the IED blast in Syria. But woven around the scar, in beautiful dark ink, was a tattoo. It wasn't a symbol of death. It was a pair of angel wings, but one wing was made of feathers and the other was made of medical gauze. The sunlight hit the ink, making it look like it was glowing. Elara took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the spring air. She looked at the sky, imagining Jamie looking down, smiling that goofy, lopsided smile of his. "Code clear," she whispered to the wind. She lowered her arms, turned, and walked through the open doors of the center. She had work to do, but this time, she wasn't doing it to hide. She was doing it to live. The story of Elara Vance and Elias Rook reminds us that true worth is never found in titles, bank accounts, or expensive clothes. Dr. Thorne looked at a homeless man and saw nothing but waste, while Elara looked at the same man and saw a human being worthy of dignity. In our daily lives, we often rush past the quiet, invisible people around us, forgetting that everyone has a story, a battle they are fighting, and a value that cannot be measured by the world's standards. True integrity is doing the right thing not because it is easy or profitable, but because it is right. Like Elara, we must be brave enough to stand up for the vulnerable, even if it means standing alone. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button to help us spread this message of hope and resilience. Share this video with your friends and family because you never know who needs to be reminded of their own inner strength today. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a powerful story like this one. Let us pray. May God grant you the eyes to see the hidden value in every soul you meet, and the courage to be a light in the darkness. May He heal the wounds you carry in silence, just as He healed Elara, and remind you that no matter how lost you feel, you are never forgotten and you are never alone. If you receive this blessing and agree, please write Amen in the comments below. God bless you.